Welcome to a new episode of the China Horizons podcast series. My name is Mario Esteban, and I'm the director of the Center for East Asian Studies of the Autonomous University of Madrid. Today's episode is part of our ongoing commitment to the Horizon Europe project, China Horizons, which aims to explore China's role in global development and its impact across different sectors. We are diving into the fascinating world of Chinese international contractors and their corporate social responsibility practices. Our guest today is Lin Yue, an expert in Chinese economic development and global integration. His recent paper, Between Political Legitimacy and Strategic Competitiveness, oversees corporate social responsibility patterns of Chinese international contractors, sheds light on why Chinese companies are embracing corporate social responsibility and how they are adapting it abroad. Lin Yue, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mario. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of the work our team have done.
Let's start with the basics. In your paper, you talk about Chinese international contractors and their overseas corporate social responsibility patterns. Can you give us a brief overview of what led you to study this topic?
Sure. Over 2 decades, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese international contractors have experienced explosive growth. By 2021, 79 of the top 250 global international contractors in terms of their overseas revenues were from mainland China, with their total overseas revenues of over 100 million US dollars. This signifies that these companies have become foreign runners in the global contracting market, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative. These firms have been touted as key contributors to the welfare of the host societies as the Chinese government has propaganded. However, the construction industry itself faces unavoidable issues such as environment damage, hazardous working conditions, and accusations of unethical conduct. This contradiction leads us to ask key questions, That is, to what extent have these companies embraced the social responsibility in the third countries, particularly in developing countries where such efforts are most needed? Specifically, under the current Horizon European project, we wanted to update our knowledge on their CSR or social responsibility practices and focusing on the patterns and the motivations of their practices.
So, the rapid growth of Chinese international contractors also brings social and environmental challenges. What factors are driving their adoption of corporate social responsibility overseas?
Our research finds that political legitimacy and strategic competitiveness are the two main motivations driving the Chinese international contractors overseas social responsibility activities. First of all, the Chinese government increasingly emphasizes the CSR as an important tool for diplomatic soft power, viewing it as critical for maintaining the country's image and enhancing the legitimacy of the Belt and Road Initiative. This pressure encourages the Chinese international contractors to use the CSR as a tool to gain the political legitimacy, often through charitable donations and crisis management to enhance the country's global image. Essentially, the Chinese international contractors see fully fulfilling philanthropic responsibility as a baseline, and they publicize related performances records to secure domestic political legitimacy.
Does that mean that the corporate social responsibility activities developed abroad by Chinese international contractors are mostly about satisfying government requirements? I mean, Chinese government requirements.
Yeah, sure. But not entirely. The level of internationalizations also influence how these companies understand and practice the social responsibilities. As they become more internationalized, their dependency on Chinese government resources diminishes. That means they can leverage, for example, the international financial resources for their foreign expansions. So they will face an increasing pressures from both international and the host countries' governance systems to maintain sustainable in competitiveness in the global market. More internationalized Chinese international contractors will pay great attention to external stakeholders' interests and begin to view the CSR, the social responsibility, as a strategic asset for themselves, for their own interest. So these firms are increasingly integrating this concept into their business operations, particularly those with a larger scale and higher overseas revenue. They will focus on improving, for example, the project quality, the ensuring the labor safety, and enhancing their relationship with the local force by providing the skills trainings, etc.
So let's focus a little bit more on the relationship with different stakeholders. Can you talk specifically about how these Chinese international contractors' interests interact with those different stakeholders?
Yeah, this is a challenging question because the social responsibility is very broad. Our research will distinguish basically between the economic stakeholders and society stakeholders. For society stakeholders, we mean that they have no contractual relationship with the companies, and they will impact indirectly the profits levels of the company. While we talk about the economic stakeholders, that basically we refer to those who have a contractual relationship with the company, such as the labor, the supplier, the customer, etc., and they will have immediate impact on the company's profits. So then, basically, if you read our research report, the CSR, the international contractors, the Chinese international contractors' social responsibility patterns with the society stakeholders demonstrate three main characteristics. The first of all, that is, all these companies actively involved in overseas projects will see the fulfilling charitable responsibility as a minimum requirement, as demanded by the Chinese government. And they publicly release relevant performance records to gain political legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese government. Then secondly, the more internationalized Chinese international contractors are more likely to carry out profound community development, viewing these as commercial solutions to enhance the project efficiency and sustainability. Thirdly, even those most internationalized Chinese international contractors with sound community development projects still lack mechanisms for the participations of the external stakeholders in the process of decision making, with minimum direct involvement from the societal stakeholders in the planning and executions of the CSR initiatives.
And could you elaborate a little bit more on the economic stakeholders? Do Chinese international contractors take a similar approach?
With economic stakeholders, the Chinese international contractors take a more economically driven approach. That means basically the focus on, for example, the project quality and the labor safeties as key factors in winning customers' trust and securing more contracts to be able to remain competitive in the global market. Secondly, those companies are increasingly inclined to source materials and the labors locally to reduce costs and improve operational efficiency. The third, these companies are playing greater emphasis on training local force and employing localized management to combine the local expertise with Chinese management skills, ultimately for the aim to improve their cost effectiveness.
Well, that's a really interesting distinction between economic and societal stakeholders. But let's move now to methodology. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of methodology you've used in your research?
Sure. First of all, we follow an institutional and political economy approach to guide our investigations. And the main problem at the moment of conducting the investigations, that is, we have very limited structured data available about the Chinese contractors' CSR activities, especially abroad. So we constructed a unique data set from the reports that these companies released, we select 50 top Chinese international contractors. We draw the CSR-related reports, such as annual reports, the social responsibility reports, the ESG reports, etc. And then we also look at their website to compile any kind of news media releases and their self-declarations of their practices. After that, we use the contact analysis systematically to explore their patterns across different host countries. The mixed methods approach allow us to uncover both quantitatively and qualitatively the trends and the nuances in their strategies. We classify or distinguish 6 dimensions under the broad CSR concept. 3 of them are basically targeting the societal stakeholders, and the other 3 is focusing on economic stakeholders. For economic stakeholders, we identify their relationship with the customer, the supplier, and the local labor or employees. For the societal responsibilities, then basically it is about their economic, their environmental initiatives, their relationship with the local communities, and the respect of the human rights in broad sense. We then assess the depths and the journeyiness of CSR commitment by analyzing the project-specific initiatives, resource allocations, and the engagement levels, particularly looking at whether their efforts went beyond the surface-level philanthropies. For example, the genuine engagement with the local communities would encompass the building of dialogue mechanisms, the long-term skills development, and infrastructure contributions that will have long-lasting impact on well-being of local populations even after the terminations of the project.
Well, that sounds like a quite robust approach. You mentioned previously that the degree of internationalization of Chinese international contractors is quite crucial. Essentially, the more internationalized a company is, the more it sees corporate social responsibility not just as a box-ticking exercise, but as an integral part of its competitiveness abroad. Can we suppose that with Chinese companies going global, their corporate social responsibility perceptions and practices will converge with international standards?
That's a very good question. In the surface, formally, we can expect that for the modernizations of the CSR governance systems within the company, etc. But on the other hand, we will see that not necessarily that we will converge with the international standards. It is because comparing with the international trend that emphasizes social dialogue and transparent management, the Chinese international contractors, even though they have demonstrated and be exposed more to the international scrutiny and tend to address external pressures more systematically, they stayed and the limits of the capacities of the societal stakeholders in the CSR decision making still very limited because they are not fully embraced the underlying democratic principles in arranging the relationship with the local societies or local communities or the NGOs, etc. So the CSRs or the Chinese international contractor CSR activities abroad for the moment that we can bestly framed as remaining in a transitional phases. That is from primarily philanthropy-based, moral motivated CSR to one that is driven more by economic interests. However, they have not yet fully consolidated the second phase and are still lagging behind forming genuine multiple stakeholder governance systems with multiple stakeholders.
Well, what you just said that reminds me something you mentioned in your article, which I think is very important to highlight, which is that while your study systematically evaluates the corporate social responsibility patterns of these Chinese international contractors, your research, it primarily relies on self-reported data by those contractors, right, themselves. So this introduces certain biases and necessitates more like on-ground research for a balanced understanding. Have you done that kind of work?
The article itself, yes, the methodologically, it is both innovative but also limited. For the innovative side, that is, we finally compile a structured data to understand this group of enterprises. But for the other side, of course, you can see that it is based on the one side of views, and we need to balance it with the more observations from the on-ground practices and the opinions of the stakeholders affected. So yes, thanks for bringing this up. And indeed, especially thanks to the Horizon Europe project, we have done several field works in Algeria and Serbia. Our field work in these countries have already enriched our understanding of the rationales behind the Chinese overseas CSR, the social responsibility. In Algeria, for instance, the Chinese construction firms initially faced criticism for employing predominantly the Chinese workers rather than hiring locally. But they have largely reversed this tendency in the last 5 or 6 years, significantly improving the localizations of their labor force. However, this change is not simply due to the previous backlash of the Chinese government requirement to improve their international image. Rather, from our interviews, the companies highlighted the economic rationality of this adjustment in their labor approach.
Well, so it seems like your fieldwork in Algeria confirms what you stated in the article, that Chinese international contractors are more economically driven to fulfill their responsibilities towards economic stakeholders, I mean, including their workers. Is that right?
To some degree, yes. But we need to emphasize that the companies in Algeria that we have interviewed, their dependency on more local labor could also be seen as an adaptive responses to the changing environment and not an outcome of the systematically readjustment of their strategy. For example, in Algeria, in the last 5 or 6 years, there were diminishing numbers of large-scale public projects, the limitations on the payments in US dollars, and the visa restrictions on Chinese workers, not to mention the impact of the pandemic. So it's not certain yet whether the localization of the labor force we observed will be sustained once the environment changed again. For example, the Algerian government returns to an investment-driven development mode, focusing on the speed of the outcomes of those projects, etc. So additionally, we should not confuse the labor localizations with the management localizations. It is quite important because these companies, yes, they hire more local workers, but the management team was still kind of Chineseness. So the Chinese state-owned enterprises intends to impose a kind of corporate culture with Chinese characteristics on Algerian workers. It is quite different and distinct from the local ethics.
And what about Serbia? Did you find like a similar situation there?
In Serbia, we go beyond the construction sectors, and we have looked at, we're trying to interview the enterprises investing in productive sectors like mining or the steel making or in the heavy industries. Yes, we observed a similar predominance of economic rationality in Serbia. The companies was heavily facilitated by the practical support from the Serbian government and Chinese authorities. And the support provided the companies with some liberal spaces to prioritize the economic interests, focusing primarily on job creations initially. But as our previous work have demonstrated that once you have those responsibilities driven by the economic rationality, that will prioritize the economic stakeholders rather than societal stakeholders. So in all the companies we have interviewed in Serbia, they have a very high level of the local force participations, over 90%, etc. But their environmental commitment was quite limited in the initial phase. What's different in Serbia is that after that, there is a thematic improving on the environmental compliance. And it's partly due to the EU force on the normative definitions and the active role of the environmental NGOs there, which pushed the Chinese companies to step up its CSR efforts, particularly in environmental governance.
Well, so it seems that local dynamics really shape these companies' strategies. Do you think that the dual pressures, like political and strategic, create any conflicts for these companies?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. That is, the Chinese international companies quite like the other multinational enterprises, that they are facing constantly the two contrasting objectives. One is the economic profits, the other one is the societal commitment, which is not always compatible and sometimes contrasting. And in the case of the Chinese companies, they are trapped in two kinds of legitimacies that they have to solve. One is the internal and the other is external. Internally, these companies need to align with Chinese government directives, which can sometimes contradict their short-term economic goals, leading to symbolic compliance, for example, the over-focus on the philanthropic activities. And externally, they need to adhere to international standards, which demand long-term sustainability and social welfare. The dual expectations can lead to inconsistencies, especially when companies face different stakeholders' demands in specific host countries. For instance, in Algeria, the priority for the companies there is to satisfy the host government's requirement of the executing the projects quickly. They initially don't care about how the workers are mobilized. What they're asking for is the rapidness of the termination of the project. And in contrast, Serbia's regulatory environment forced the companies into a more proactive standards and hiring more local workers from the very beginning.
That's quite a balancing act. It reminds me of the dual track corporate social responsibility governance that you mentioned in another paper related to the Belt and Road Initiative. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, thanks, Mario. That is the work we have done together. That is the book we have published last year on the China international norms. And so in that book, I have raised this concept of a dual track CSR region. But at the moment, I was focusing on the state sector, state actors, not the companies, but the state actors, the Chinese government itself. So the Chinese government itself also, like the company actors, trapped in this internal-external legitimacy contradictions or dilemma. Domestically, so the CSR is viewed more as an extension of the state policy, but internationally, there is a greater emphasis on aligning with the global standards to improve the country's image. This allows the Chinese authority to maintain a positive diplomatic image and align with the international norms while not necessarily applying the same standards at home. It's a way of mitigating the criticisms abroad while preserving a distinct governance model domestically. So that previous work is also why we conducted this research currently published, basically to understand how companies themselves interpret this political message and how they behave accordingly.
Well, it's fascinating to see how complex and diverse are the calculations of Chinese authorities and how adaptable Chinese companies have to be. Let's look ahead. What do you think are the key challenges for Chinese international contractors in continuing this balance of political legitimacy and competitiveness?
The main challenge is consistency. As these companies expand into more diverse environments, maintaining consistent social responsibility practices that align with both domestic and international or local expectations becomes increasingly complex. There is also the issues of perception. It's whether the stakeholders themselves genuinely see these companies as responsible actors or just as following orders for reputational purposes. In Serbia, for example, even though the Chinese companies have already put a lot of efforts on the environmental protections, there are still doubts about whether these actions are genuine or just for show. So moving forward, the Chinese international contractors will need to bridge the gap between their stated commitments and on-the-ground practices to sustain their competitiveness and credibility, especially abroad.
Well, that's definitely going to be a tough path forward. But before we wrap up, is there a takeaway message would you like to give to our listeners?
I think the main takeaway is that the Chinese social responsibilities, from the view of the Chinese international contractors, is much more than just a box-ticking exercise. It's a nuanced strategy to navigate international pressures, secure competitiveness, and contribute to China's broader diplomatic aims. Understanding this context helps to appreciate the complexities these companies face in international markets. The CSR is not just a moral choice, it's a strategic one influenced by political, economic, and cultural factors.
Well, thank you so much, Lin Yue. This has been an incredibly insightful discussion into the corporate social responsibility strategies of Chinese companies operating abroad and the intricate dynamics they face. We will be definitely keeping an eye on how these strategies evolve, especially with the ongoing developments in global politics and the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm Mario Esteban, Director of the Center for East Asian Studies of the Autonomous University of Madrid. We have discussed with Professor Yue Lin about his paper, Between Political Legitimacy and Strategic Competitiveness, Overseas Corporate Social Responsibility Patterns of Chinese International Contractors. You can find more information about the China Horizon project dealing with a resurgent China on our webpage. And you can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you for listening to the China Horizon podcast series.
Thanks, Mario. Look forward to the following episode.